shadow was hidden in the dark corners. Every night when the clock struck past midnight, strange sounds echoed from the walls. These whispers seemed to come from ancient times, from the depths of history. I, who had recently moved into this house, initially thought that these sounds might be due to the building's age. But night after night, the whispers grew stronger, and sometimes a shadow would appear in the corner of my eye and then disappear. One night, when the clock reached 3:30, the moonlight streaming through the window suddenly darkened. I felt it hard to breathe. The room's temperature dropped significantly. I turned around and saw a large, terrifying shadow standing in the corner of the room. This shadow had a humanoid shape, but its eyes were empty and lifeless, staring at me as if from the depths of hell. The shadow slowly moved towards me, and I, paralyzed with fear, could only watch. As it approached, a whispering voice came from it, a voice that seemed to be from other worlds. But before I could discern the words, everything fell silent. From that night on, the shadow returned every night, but it never harmed me. It seemed to only want to show its presence, or perhaps convey a message to me. But I could never understand its meaning, and this story remains without an end. Nights continued, and the shadow kept returning, each time with more violence. The sound of its steps in the silence of the night, like drums of death, shook my heart. The walls seemed to crack with each of its steps, and moans could be heard from within them. One night, when the shadow entered the room, it reached out to me, a hand made of darkness, and with its touch, I felt a deadly chill. I, no longer able to control my fear, screamed and jumped back. But the shadow, without any reaction, just stood there, staring at me. Days passed, and I could no longer distinguish between reality and imagination. Was this shadow real, or just a product of my inner fears? Was the house cursed, or had I gone mad? Every night, I waited for the shadow's return, and each time, it brought with it a greater sense of dread. But it never harmed me. Perhaps it only wanted to scare me, or maybe it had a message that I still couldn't understand. And this story too remains without an end. Days turned into endless nights, and shadows took life in every corner of the house. The whispers turned into screams that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth. The shadow that came every night was no longer alone. It had companions, each more terrifying than the last. One night when the clock struck 3 and 1 minute, the room suddenly shook. Hands emerged from the walls, reaching out to me. I, unable to escape, was caught in their grasp. The shadows surrounded me, and their demonic laughter filled the room. At that moment, one of the shadows, larger and more terrifying than the others, stepped forward. It had a face that seemed to emerge from the worst nightmares. Its eyes, like 2 endless black pits, seemed to swallow everything. The great shadow, with a voice that seemed to come from the depths of hell, said, "You have been chosen." And at that moment, the hands that held me began to pull me towards the wall. I knew that if I entered the wall, there would be no return. In the final moments, as I was being drawn to the wall, suddenly a bright light shone through the window, and the shadows, one after another, disappeared. I, with all my might, freed myself from the hands that held me and ran towards the light. When I reached the outside, the sun was rising, and I knew that the terrifying night had ended. But this was not the end of the story. I still didn't know what the shadows were, and why they had chosen me. And perhaps I will never understand. And this story too remains without an end.